Okay, welcome back to Canon Law and Exile. I apologize for my coughing fit last time, and I'm forming a posse to see which of you poisoned the after dinner liqueur of the Italian table. Um, so stay tuned for future developments. We were talking last time about the supreme authority in the church, so we're continuing on with lesson 7. We're going to finish talking about the Pope, but we'll also talk mostly about the bishops today. We said that although the Pope has, we just famously said, supreme, full, immediate, universal, ordinary power in the church, nonetheless, his he does not have absolute power. He's not the master of revelation. He's the servant of revelation. He can't abolish the episcopate, etc. Um, so I think good things to keep in mind. If you're interested in these issues, where you find it in the code is in the 330s, where we've been in the 331 and to 333 especially. You might read some commentaries on these. A particularly good one is the Navarre commentary, which talks about these things. Also, Canon 333 mentions that there is no appeal or recourse against a decision of the Roman pontiff. Why not? Um, who would you appeal to? If there's someone to appeal to, that is really the supreme authority, right? If we said, well, you could appeal from the Pope to the, Patriarch of Constantinople. Really, then the Patriarch of Constantinople is the supreme authority in the Church. So the no appeal or recourse from a decision of the Roman Pontiff. You may recall historically in the uh, really, I think around the 15th century, it came up this uh, idea of conciliarism, and the what conciliarism meant was that it was an attempt to make a council superior to the Pope, to essentially have the council be the one, or the next ecumenical council be the one that could sort of supervise the Pope. In fact, at one time, the idea was that the Pope would have to have his decisions confirmed every 5 or 10 years by a council, and the Church really struggled with this for a long time. So conciliarism is a danger. Fortunately, we're well beyond it now, but that the threat of it is very important historically, but we still see it in our institutions and law now. That danger of trying to put another authority above the Pope. What's so bad about conciliarism? Why? We said that we have two. Last time we said that we have two governing authorities. We have two supreme authorities in the Church: the Roman Pontiff and the College of Bishops. Uh, why? Why do we need? Do we actually need both? Could we cross out the Roman Pontiff and just have the College of Bishops? We'd still have a supreme authority, right? Um, so why not do it that way? We could get in touch with the Lord and say, Lord, you may have overlooked something. We think we have a better way that you could have done things. So if we had that and he gave us a hearing, how might that hearing go? Um, well, one thing, if we had the College of Bishops as the sole supreme authority, what do we have? Well, first, we still have something that comes right from Christ. The office of bishop comes from Christ. The college, the college Yeah, I don't know if we have the college anymore because we don't have the head. We at least have the bishops, though. Um, what's the problem with having the college of bishops or the group of bishops as the sole governing authority? Well, we've seen one problem when we talked about Apostolicae Curiae, the decision on Anglican orders from 1896, that the Pope can just exercise his authority in a more energetic, practical way than a college could do. Also, conditions might simply prevent the college from meeting. How many bishops do you need to make a decision? What's a quorum among the worldwide group of bishops? What about times of widespread war, repression, persecution, etc.? Really, the historical norm has been repression and war more than it has been peace and acceptance of Christianity. So uh, keep those practical things in mind, even if they're not, they may not be the challenges that we're facing right now. Also, keep in mind some historical challenges. What do you do when a Henry II arises in England, or a Frederick II in the whole Holy Roman Empire, or Napoleon in France? Well, what do they have in common? Great persecutors of the church and of the Pope in particular. You can see the Pope, a Pope standing up to each of those, as the popes in those times did. It's hard to it's hard to see how a college stands up to an emperor. Does the college really have the same unity of purpose or and just energy of action to be able to speak for the whole church in a way that the Pope does? Anyway, kind of some hopefully interesting historical observations. But some of these things, if you the more familiar you are with church history, the more you think back on it, I think you can see the more reasons that we need a pontiff who can exercise supreme authority on his own, though the supreme authority is also enriched by having the college with the pope at the head at the same time. Anyway, if you have any observations on this, either canonically, doctrinally, or historically, please share them with me and with others. But the law is quite clear anyway, so our source here is really Canon 333. Okay, that's essentially the conclusion of what we were going to say about the Pope. Let's talk more specifically about the bishops. What is this? If you're following in Woodall, page 121, what's the source of the power of the bishops? Not the Pope. The Pope is not the source of the bishop's power. Rather, the Lord is. Again, we said both by divine will, both the collegial and the primatial come from the will of the Lord. Both the patron ministry and the apostolic ministry, they both are coming from the Lord. Recall we had our list of the qualifiers of the Pope's power, those five qualifiers. We have a similar list in Canon 333, Section 1, about here we need an amendment for Woodall. Woodall says Woodall says that Canon 333, Section 1 is about bishops. That's only kind of true. It's about diocesan bishops. So you may want to write that in. This is around page 121 or 122 in Woodall, because not everything that's said in 333, Section 1 about diocesan bishops is true of all bishops. So kind of keep that in mind. 333, Section 1 talks about the authority of the diocesan bishop. Um, and it says that he has proper, ordinary, and immediate power. So this should be somewhat familiar. We've already talked about ordinary power and immediate power. What's ordinary power? Comes from an office. the bishop, the diocesan bishop, has his office. Immediate. We say immediate because, as we said, he does not get his authority from the Pope. He gets it from God. The office of bishop also is instituted by Christ himself, just as the office of Pope is. Okay, so then what is proper authority? That is one that we have not talked about yet. Proper authority is authority that is not dependent on another person. By the way, all of these different terms that we've talked about with both the Pope's authority and the bishop's authority are ones that you may add to your glossary. I think they might be helpful to you. I think, as I said, the previous list of the Pope's the characteristics of his authority, I think they all add something. Well, proper authority, again, we said, means that the authority is not dependent on another person. How do we understand this? We're saying the diocesan bishop, he's the authority in his diocese. His authority is not dependent on another person. Yes, he can be supervised in some ways by the Pope, or the Pope has oversight in some ways over him, but in a sense, he is the head of his local church, his diocese. Who would not have proper authority? The vicar general, because the vicar general, his authority, you see it in his name, vicar. He doesn't have proper authority. He has vicarious authority. His authority is dependent on the diocesan bishop. So the diocesan bishop has ordinary, proper power. Ordinary, connected to an office. Proper, not dependent on another person. But the vicar general has ordinary, vicarious power. Ordinary, also connected to an office, but vicarious, not independent of others, but dependent on the office of diocesan bishop. The diocesan bishop named him vicar general, and he can remove him as well. Okay, why do we only say these three things? Proper, ordinary, and immediate. Why don't we say full? Doesn't the bishop have full authority, at least in some sense, at least in the diocese? Not so much, because not to the same extent that we would say that about the Pope. Keep in mind the things where other entities have power, even in the diocese. For instance, over liturgy, the Holy See, both the Conference of Bishops and the Holy See have a big role in the liturgy, in preparing liturgical books, even in some dispensations and penalties, as we saw in Lesson 6. So we can't really say that the bishop, the diocesan bishop, has full authority, because there are some things, even though Vatican II is recognizing a great deal of decentralization and emphasis on the bishop. Still, there's some things that even concern the individual diocese that the Holy See is going to retain control over, or is going to give it to other entities like the Conference of Bishops. Okay, the College of Bishops, this is around page 122 in Woodall, and what Woodall tells us is that the union of the college, the union of the bishops in the college with the Roman pontiff and with each other, is essential. It's essential to their legal or juridical capacity. The canon Woodall cites is Canon 10. It's very important. Again, when we think of the authority of the College of Bishops, we're usually going to be thinking of an ecumenical council. That's where we really see it, I think, in a sense, exercised to the full. Now, in a council, the Pope decides on which matters will be discussed, but all the bishops have the right and the duty to participate. So at Vatican II, we had 3,000 bishops. Really everyone who could, went to Rome for the council. And the bishops have a deliberative vote. They're not just consulting, they have a deliberative vote. That means they're actually deciding, they're actually voting on the documents. They're actually making amendments to the documents. So a deliberative vote means they're actually deciding versus consultative. Consultative means they're not deciding. Advisory is the same as consultative. That means that the Holy Father respects your opinion, or the bishop respects your opinion and asks for it, but he's not looking to you to decide. Here in a council, the bishops actually have a deliberative voice, not just consultative or advisory. Okay, there's also such a thing, though, as collegial action dispersed throughout the world. This is in Canon 337, Section 2. A collegial act, but it's where the bishops are dispersed throughout the world. What does that mean? It means they're not gathered together in council. They're back in their homes. They're back in their sees. So the bishops can act even collegially, even when they're dispersed. A really good example of this is the John Paul II issued an encyclical on human life in 1995 called Evangelium Vitae, and he consulted the bishops. He actually contacted the bishops throughout the world, and he asked them what their teaching was, what their view was on certain things, especially on the taking of innocent human life, on abortion, and on euthanasia. And then he made pronouncements on those things in this encyclical, but he made them not as pope, but he made them he made them as pope, but he made them as a declaration of what the bishops had taught and were teaching collegially, but collegially in the sense of dispersed throughout the world. So really what we would call the ordinary magisterium when we get to our lesson on the teaching office. Okay, so then when you find out what the bishops are teaching, then the Pope's role is to proclaim that or to accept that. And in Evangelium Vitae in 1995, you have that proclamation and acceptance. Okay, what's another way for the bishops to exercise their authority? You've certainly heard of the Synod of Bishops. This has been a institution that we got at Vatican II, or shortly after Vatican II, and has become somewhat important in recent years, though also somewhat controversial. In the Synod of Bishops, though, the bishops, their voice is not deliberative. It's only consultative in the Synod. In the Ecumenical Council, it's deliberative. They're actually deciding. In the Synod of Bishops, it's merely consultative. They're only advising the Pope. It's the Pope who writes what's usually an exhortation after the Synod. The Pope could give the bishops authority to decide a particular issue or a number of issues, but basically the popes have not done that yet. Okay. If the Pope dies either during a council or a synod of bishops, the council or the synod is suspended. One thing to notice about Woodall's treatment of the Synod of Bishops, I think he's kind of prescient. He talks on 127 about some people thinking that the role of the Curia and the Secretariat of the Synod may be too great. That criticism has really kind of come to the fore because some of the recent synods have been controversial, and that opinion, even though Woodall is writing in 2011 before these things happened, so Woodall seems to be quite ahead of the curve. And he also talked about, again on 127, is the synod too political or too potentially political? Again, you may agree with him or disagree with him. we don't have to accept all of his judgments. But I do think it's interesting. I do think you do have to give him credit that he sees something in the synod that could be controversial, or could generate some disagreement in the church. And this has happened with a number of synods too. I think it's just been probably more so with the recent synod, the Amazon synod, and the synod on the family. But kind of interesting to see Woodall's perspective and his view, though he does not say a great deal about them. Okay, that pretty much is all that you needed to read. However, there was a whole nother section on the cardinals and the Roman Curia that I want to talk about a little bit, even though you didn't have to read them. Um, on page 128, again, this was not in your reading, so don't worry about it, but Woodall talks about the cardinals. The reason I had you skip it is just that we have to skip some things because we don't have time. And if you're interested, Woodall's treatment is fine. So just go back and read what Woodall says about the cardinals. But I'll just summarize a few things. What's so interesting about the cardinals is there's no sacramental basis for cardinals, for being a cardinal. It's a creation completely of ecclesiastical law, completely of human law, and nonetheless, it has been an unbelievably endurable, I'm sorry, unbelievably durable situation and way of selecting the popes. We've been selecting the popes this way almost for 1,000 years, since about 1060, 1059 or 1060. Really interesting. It almost makes you think, even though we're talking about a human institution with the cardinals and the cardinals as papal electors, you really see that it really seems like there's more to it than just human law, though this is also a very good example of human law completing divine law, giving us a way of ensuring the perpetuation of the patron office. The main cardinals do a lot of different things, but their main function is to elect the pope. That's what the most important thing about cardinals are is that they are papal electors. If you want to know about the numbers of cardinals and how old you have to be, you can find that in Woodall. That'd be fun to talk about. Papal elections are always fun to talk about. But by the way, we skip papal elections too, again, for the same reason. Woodall covers it fine. There's lots of really fun historical stuff we could discuss. Maybe we can do that sometime at the Unstable. But it's not something we'll test on. And if you're interested, what Woodall has is fine. I did want to talk a little bit though about the Curia. Woodall talks about the Roman Curia on page 130, and then for several pages there. Again, this was not in your reading, but we should say a little bit about it. First, he talks about, when we talk about the Curia, each department within the Curia we call a dicastery. Um, your parallel in the secular world would be like the cabinet offices underneath the president, and then IES is just the plural. So a dicastery would be like the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith is one of the dicasteries. There are a number of them and a number of different types of dicasteries. You actually should know some of these, even though you didn't do the reading. The only ones I'll ask you to know are ones that we've already talked about in class. I'm going to just show you some notes here to see if they're legible so that we can see. You can see these are the different types of entities in the Curia. The Secretariat of State is kind of its own thing, very powerful, very important. Under some popes, the Secretariat of State is the most important dicastery. Under other popes, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith is the most important dicastery. The congregations, they come right after the Secretariat of State and are probably the most powerful, the most important. Um, there's a there's kind of a maxim that all of the dicasteries are equal. That's kind of true in a sense, but in a more real world sense, everybody kind of knows that a congregation is has more authority than a pontifical commission. So again, the kind of the law doesn't always track exactly what our sort of political or on the ground reality is. For the congregations, just some ones for you to know are the highlighted ones. CDF, Doctrine of the Faith, we've talked about, especially with penal law, very important. CDW, Divine Worship. And then bishops, just we're going to talk in our next lesson about the choice of bishop. Then clergy, if you have any issues with Rome or any issues with your own bishop, you likely would be going to clergy. Kickelsal, that is for religious issues, also important for those of you who are members of religious communities. And then skip down, pontifical councils. There are a couple of them. The only one really important for you to know is PSILT, the Pontifical Council for Legislative Texts, which interprets the code officially for the Pope. Then pontifical commissions. You don't need to know any of those. If you just want an example of one, there's one called the Commission for Life, the Laity, and the Family. Those used to be three separate things. Now they're all together. The Commission for Social Communications would be another one. You don't need to know those. And then the tribunals. The tribunals, in a sense, don't fit too well as a dicastery. You don't, when you think of a dicastery, you don't really think of a tribunal, but the document that organizes the curia discusses the tribunals too. So they're dicasteries in a sense. And we've talked about some of them. The Apostolic Penitentiary with penal law, the Roman Rota, we haven't really talked too much about in our class, but we'll talk at least a little bit about in Canon Law 2 because it's the main appellate tribunal for marriage cases. And then the Apostolic Signatura is the highest court in the church. And then the CDF, which again, we usually think of as a congregation, but as we saw with SST in Lesson 6, the CDF also is a tribunal for so-called grave delicts or graviora delicta. Okay, one final note that Woodall gives us is sometimes some of these dicasteries, especially the congregations, but even others, they'll issue documents, and sometimes the documents are in forma ordinaria, and sometimes they're in forma specifica. Again, if you want to look this up, look at Woodall, page 134. What's the difference? If it says in forma specifica, that means that the Pope has read the document and he's embracing it as his own. So even though the author is Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, if it says, and at the end there will usually be a formula that says, in an audience granted to the prefect on the 23rd of March, the Holy Father approve this document, and it'll say something like informa specifica there. That means it has additional authority because it's not only the congregation, even though the congregation's pretty high authority already, but the Pope has made it his own. If it's approved in forma specifica, he's made it his own. However, if the Pope approves it only in forma ordinaria, it probably won't even say anything about that. It'll probably just, maybe it might say the Pope approved it. But if it doesn't say in forma specifica, that just means there's nothing wrong with that. That's just kind of your garden variety pronouncement, and it means that it's the office itself speaking, but not with the Pope having actually made the document his own. Okay, thank you very much. This is the end of lesson 7. So our next lesson will be lesson 8, where we'll cover the local church. Thank you very much.